Okay, that little voice saying recording in progress is my sign that we're starting our evening. Thank you all for coming. I realize it might not be evening for everyone, depending on where you're tuning in from, but I want to welcome you to our series of discussions in a webinar format on the Israeli-Hamas war. We've been doing this for a few weeks, and we have different guests each week. I'm Amy Weinreb. I'm the head of the Masa Leadership and Impact Center that is sponsoring this series. And I want to tell you a little bit about the structure before we get started, and then our host and co-host are going to introduce each other and lead you into the conversation. Here's how it works. For the first 20 minutes, we have our speaker, Rabbi Michael Unterberg, who is going to be talking to us about today's theme, which is what is complex and what is not complex in the current conflict. 20 minutes, and then it becomes a round table. And during that time, you can ask anything you want. It's often a discussion between members of the staff, a lot of our fellows and community members and alum also chime in. And then we have a hard stop for the discussion at 10 o'clock Israel time, and I stop recording. But the night doesn't quite end there. I actually stay in the room for an extra 20 minutes. Anyone is welcome to come and ask questions that might be specific to Masa, if they didn't quite understand something, if they feel like they need social or emotional or intellectual support beyond what happened in the meeting. That's the time to do it. Then I say goodbye, another hard stop at 10:20, but those last 20 minutes are informal and not recorded. So one of the things I like to do at the beginning of each of these meetings too is just in the chat, go ahead and say where you're zooming in from. It gives us a sense, and it gives us also a record of where people are joining us, and that's always fun. And the other thing I want to say, and this is important, is as you're listening to our guest speaker, Michael, if a question comes into your mind, that's the time to write it down in the chat. Don't let it go cold or forget. Even if he answers your question or addresses it later in the talk, write it down. And when the Q&A session starts, I can refer to some of those questions, but we can also talk more spontaneously by using the raising hand icon. So I'm going to hand this over to Benji Davis. Benji, if you can just describe who you are and then introduce Michael, that will be great, and we can get started.
Existential philosophical question. Who am I? My name is, you can see in my little box, Benji Davis.
Benji, first, I need you to put your microphone somehow closer to your mouth. I'm going to be really strict about clear sound because I want us to be able to hear.
Can you hear me now?
That. Yes.
So, firstly, before I even introduce myself, I want to invite everyone who would like to open their cameras, and we can see all your pretty faces. Just because it's actually, I'm going to go against what Amy said. This isn't a webinar. We're on the web, but this is more of an educational conversation that we're going to be having. And so, hopefully we'll be having some sort of dialogue, be able to see each other. It's helpful, but I understand if you're not in the circumstances to share your camera.
I'm also going to say this, Benji, which is if everyone could just turn on their cameras now. I always like to take a picture of us all together just for a moment. If everybody, at least on the first frame, can turn on their cameras, I'll take a picture, and then you can kind of see how it feels, and then you can decide.
Great. So
cameras on, everybody? Sort of?
Yeah. There's only so much you can do. So yeah, I'm Benji. I'm originally from LA, and I moved to Israel in 2009. I did a gap year. I guess it was technically through Masa in 2005, 2006, although I was not aware. And I'm at my gap year right now because I teach here on Wednesday evenings. It's called Nativ. So that's where I'm at right now. And this is the second session that I'm part of in terms of series to discuss and try and emotionally and cognitively wrap our whole neshamas and souls, minds around what is happening right now. And so tonight, um, we have my colleague for I think 8 years now in terms of working together in Israel education and different programs here in Israel who worked quite closely over the years. So, and what we've asked Mike, and we've rooted a little bit on this, is this kind of paradigm of what is complex and what isn't so complex in this current moment. Because a lot of the things that you're seeing, I feel, when people are talking about this conflict, is well, it's too complex, so I don't want to deal with it. Right? When people talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's this thing that's so heady, or there's so much to know. They don't know what's going on. It's just so complex. Oh my God, I can't deal with it. And there could be certain things in this current moment between Israel and Hamas that are complex and hard to deal with, but there's other things that are actually maybe quite simple that people are saying are complex, which leads to misunderstandings, false. And so I'm going to invite Mike to start off to kind of introduce this paradigm and how to think about it. We'll have a conversation. Mike's originally from New York. Went to YU, got smicha. He almost joined. He was in the police force. I don't know if anyone knows this, right? But he didn't stay on for that, and he got a great opportunity to Cleveland history department at Jewish high school, and then he decided he was teaching Zionism so much that he had to actually do something. So he made Aliyah with his family in 2011 to live in their frat. He's got 5 kids, grandkids. He had a Shiatsu dog, but I think it died. I don't know if he got a new dog. And he looks exactly like
Shiatsu is a kind of massage, Benji.
Shiatsu? What kind? What dog was it?
What we had was a mini schnauzer.
Okay, whatever. Okay,
you could have given a massage to, but yeah.
I have learning disabilities, so respect that. Yeah, I mess up. I teach for a living, and I mess up all the time. So anyway, yes, your Shiatsu dog. And Mike looks like his Bitmoji. Like some people don't look like their Bitmojis. Mike looks like Bitmoji. Anyway, Mike, take it away.
Yeah, I think I look like my Bitmoji. It isn't great. Like it just means that I have kind of a round face that looks like a Bitmoji, and so the Bitmoji ends up looking like me. How you doing, everybody? Nice to see you. I am, like Benji said, an Israel educator now for many decades. You can call me Mike when you refer to me. Benji gave you a little bit of my background, and I really think that's pretty much all you need. When Benji says that we chavruted it, he's a little bit kind of burying the lead. This whole idea for this paradigm came from literally October 8th, when as a team of colleagues, we started reacting together and sharing. And I think it was Benji's first post in our WhatsApp group, if I remember correctly, was, this is really simple. And I think this is really straightforward. And I see some nods that other people also remember that. And part of that comes from the fact that if you've been an Israel educator for any amount of time, or even if you're not officially an Israel educator, but you talk about Israel with people, you're constantly articulating the fact that this is really complicated. This is very complex. You have to approach these topics with nuance, to the point where as educators, we get tired of using the words, even though there's nothing wrong with the words per se, but it just gets exhausting. And suddenly, Benji's initial reaction was, oh, well, this one's pretty simple. And so the question is that helpful to identify in any given situation when talking about Israel? Of course, it can be used on non-Israel topics as well, to separate between what is actually complicated and what isn't. And so let's start off just showing some examples of what we mean when we say some things are complex and some things are simple, just sort of in the general discussion about Israel. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a few case studies from current events, things that we're talking about, things that people are talking about with each other on social media, in the news, and see if that paradigm is helpful. Is it helpful for our own sense of clarity? Is it helpful to avoid feeling gaslit? Can you say gaslighting in past tense? Does that work? You don't want to feel gaslit, I guess. And so let's do that. So I'm just going to start off. I'm going to put up a slide showing some pretty basic examples of complicated and simple, and then we'll try to case study it. So right now, let me share. Can everyone see that okay? And everyone can hear me okay?
Yes.
How am I doing on, I'm doing good, Amy, on the
Your
microphone?
sound is great. Yep.
Okay, Amy's very tough, you guys. If Amy says the sound is good,
I
no one
wasn't
gets to
that tough
complain.
because Benji wasn't clear at a certain point, but I've got you. You're clear.
Okay,
So
well, I'm
Masa
scared
get
of you,
that
Amy.
microphone.
All right. So in terms of on the complex side of the chart, there is no question that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is in and of itself a very complex 100-year-old conflict, and requires a good deal of looking into to understand it, preferably before you form deeply felt passionate opinions. You would expect, the requisite amount of looking into what is obviously a very complicated issue. Questions like, well, why don't the Palestinians have self-rule yet? Why don't they have their own state? Great question. The answer is actually kind of complex and requires understanding not only about Israel, but also about Palestinians and their story and their history. How can Palestinians build a better future? Well, that's a great complicated question that I think often doesn't get discussed enough. And why is that a challenge? Why does Israel still occupy the West Bank? Certainly a good chunk of Israelis would much rather not have Israel occupying the West Bank. It's not extremely popular in Israeli society. Why is that? Closer to current events, how do you fight an enemy entrenched in a civilian population? Well, that's incredibly complicated. A lot of different things have to be balanced, a lot of variables. You certainly don't want to target civilians, but you can't let the enemy continue to commit crimes against humanity. Questions about the future. What will happen to Gaza after the fall of Hamas? What will happen to the Israeli government at the end of this war? Well, these aren't only complicated questions with so many variables. It's about predicting the future, and none of us are entirely wonderful at that particular skill. So when discussing these topics, we approach them with a certain amount of humility. We seek clarity as much as possible in identifying, and I think what makes all of these complex is there's a lot of variables that have to be weighed in understanding it. So an issue that doesn't have a lot of variables is pretty simple. But an issue where there's a lot of different moving pieces to understand how, not only all the individual pieces, but how they interact, well, that's a complex system. So the other side of the chart, obviously, are the examples where there aren't that many variables. It's not really that difficult. If we define, however you define civilization, and an attitude towards humanity growing, moving forward, building a better future, it certainly shouldn't include murdering infants and gang raping women to death. So any conflict that's between civilization and barbarism, it should be seen as a fairly simple equation. If you, on the complex, how do you fight that war can be complex, but the conflict itself shouldn't be hard to understand the sides. And October 7th, I think we would agree that it's pretty simple. Turn this conflict, change the paradigm as far as, in many ways, as far as how Israeli leaders and Israeli citizens understand and look at it, and people around the world, that it changed the stakes of the conflict to one of civilization versus barbarism because of what happened on October 7th. It's also pretty simple that it is immoral to target civilians. That's not, morality is exactly the set of principles and values and rules that it doesn't matter which side you're on. In other words, if it's okay for one side and not the other, then we're not really talking about a moral equation. If targeting civilians is immoral, that's it. It's immoral for anyone. And civilian casualties are tragic, whether they were targeted or not. And so when you see, in the media, things that are happening, not only the horrors of October 7th that happened in Israel, but the death of Palestinian civilians is horrible. It's also pretty clear that Hamas is a terrorist group. That's not that complicated. A group that defends and is committed to recapitulating October 7th again and again, that views the targeting of civilians as moral. That's a terrorist group. By the way, as an aside, terrorism itself, some people say, is complex And there is a certain amount of complexity to defining the gray area. People say, well, one man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. I don't know that it's as difficult as people make it out to be. If you're targeting civilians with a political agenda, that's terrorism. And so usually it's pretty easy to tell between the terrorists and the freedom fighters. Hamas is preventing the advancement and development of Gaza, the billions of dollars poured into Gaza, which end up being spent on resources to protect Hamas and allow them to kill Jews, is not allowing. That's money that could have been spent turning Gaza into, what do they keep calling it? The Singapore of the Middle East. Living with Hamas as an active neighbor is simply not an option for Israel. In a way more intense than America, couldn't live with Al-Qaeda after 9/11. Al-Qaeda operated essentially from across the world with a long reach. Israel can't live next door to an organization with basically the same philosophy and agenda. When we see the anti-Semitic response in the wake of October 7th, that is shocking, and it is also irrational to the vandalism, the physical attacks, the language. When people in major cities in the world are yelling "gas the Jews" because of October 7th, that's both uncivilized, irrational, and that's pretty straightforward and simple. That's not so hard to understand. And frankly, Israel's right to exist is, for over 75 years, decided international law. Why that's a subject of debate eludes me, because it is a pretty simple reality. And of course, every state not only has the right to defend itself, it has a moral responsibility to defend itself and its citizens. That's not just a right, that's a responsibility that nations have to. It's the most basic responsibility, one could argue, of any government. And so that should be seen as pretty simple. And when people treat it as complicated or treat the opposite as simple, then I would argue they're either acting in bad faith. In other words, they're not really trying to get to the truth. They're just trying to advocate for a particular position. Or they're legitimately uninformed, ignorant, misled, and it could be somebody who really doesn't understand what's going on. So whether it's naive and innocent mistake, or it's a bad faith, malicious mistake, it's a mistake if you misunderstand those simple things. So, as I said, let's take that paradigm of, is it complex or is it simple? The big news story that we're mostly talking about the last few days is the Shifa Hospital battle. Now, the operation is incredibly complex. And here you have a situation where the enemy is embedded within the hospital, have actually come out of the hospital to attack Israeli soldiers, are entrenched in a system of tunnels, an underground city beneath the hospital, with the hospital on top to protect the members of Hamas. This is an incredibly complex, complicated battle scenario. All of us, I often catch myself giving opinions about how Israel and how the army should be handling this battle, and then suddenly realizing, like, I really have no idea what's going on there. I mean, I hear rumors from people whose kids are soldiers there. I'm an old man, so my generation already, it's our kids. In my case, my sons-in-law on the front lines. But before we always have to have the humility of, at a distance, we're viewing this through the media, not on the ground. And so our thoughts and opinions are valid, and we should be forming them, and we should be speaking about them, but with a certain sense of humility, because this is incredibly complicated. Normally, a military assault towards a hospital is in fact a war crime, but the international law regarding combat towards a hospital depends on if there is an enemy force attacking from the hospital. That international law protects hospitals, that even if wounded enemy combatants are in a hospital, you cannot militarily assault that hospital. However, if there is an active attack coming out of that hospital, if the people in the hospital are actively attacking your soldiers, then that protection is relieved, and the responsibility falls on the people in the hospital. So the truth about Israel committing war crimes as far as we know, is pretty simple. And Israel, I would argue, although never given the benefit of the doubt, as most Western countries would be in this scenario, as America and its allies were when it fought in Iraq, Israel, we know, and Hamas knows, by many people, will not be given the benefit of the doubt. And you can come up with your own answer as to why that is. But Hamas is relying on Israel not being the benefit of the doubt, and in that complicated scenario, with an actually pretty simple set of rules, Israel's allowed to fight and attack that hospital. It is not required by international law to send in its own medical teams to assist, to provide them with incubators from Israel to help keep the kids safe because there have been deaths. Israel is not required to send in soldiers who speak Arabic to help the medical teams at the hospital do their job and interact with what is now an army control of that hospital. And so Israel, if anything, I think is pretty simple, is going above and beyond. If Hamas needs to be defeated and they've entrenched themselves under a hospital, the need to eradicate them is pretty simple and straightforward, but everything else about it really is legitimately complex. Just to give a couple other examples, the fuel supply to Gaza. Well, if hospitals need these fuels supplies to keep the hospital running, well, that's complicated. Does Israel have an obligation under international law? Does it have a moral obligation to be the ones who provide the fuel to the region where their enemies are attacking them from? Does it have, even if it doesn't have an obligation, is there a humanitarian purpose in providing it? Knowing that not only would their enemy use that to fuel rockets against Israelis, but that their enemy is sitting on enormous amounts of fuel reserves that they are simply not giving to the hospital. And so what situation does that put Israel into? I would argue that's pretty complex. I don't know that there's a simple, I would argue that in terms of obligations, I think it's pretty simple that Israel isn't obligated, but in terms of moral calling, I don't know. I don't know that I would argue that's a fairly complicated issue. And then, so we have sometimes where there is this balance of complicated and simple, and sometimes it's just complicated or just simple. For instance, in the question of how much is Israel ready to do to sustain this war, over how much time, the challenges to civilians being on the front and leaving the economy, hemorrhaging, families struggling without so many of their loved ones. By the way, if you look at the pictures of the rally in Washington, D.C. yesterday, and you saw that enormous field of people, that is about a third larger than the number of displaced Israelis today from the south and the north who cannot live in their home. So that is actually a good visualization for that. And it's about the same number of people as are mobilized currently on the Israeli front lines in the north and the south. And so if you want to get a sense of how many Israelis' lives are disrupted, those pictures from yesterday are actually pretty helpful visual aids if your students are a visual learner, or if you yourself are a visual learner. How many casualties are we willing to sustain? How much are we willing to cause pain on the other side, targeted or not? And so I don't think these are simple questions. And to live in a country which is still in deep trauma, the process by which we decide these issues is very complex. I don't know that there's simple answers. And the space we have to give people to come up with different answers to those questions, I think has to be broad, because we've been talking about the rational sifting of complex and simple, but let's be honest, there's a deep well of traumatized emotions going on here in Israel. And so these issues, I think, are very complex. And I'll just, as I wrap up, I would just add a couple examples of things which I think are pretty simple. If how much sacrifices Israel willing to bear is a complicated question, I would just end on two what I think are pretty simple questions. One of them is, can you criticize Israeli policy, whether in general or whatever the specific issue is, or even in conduct of the war? I think that's pretty simple. Of course you can. And because our emotions are high, we may not always be totally fair, but that's how democracy works. You're allowed to do it. How much should we be doing it? Publicly browbeating the government in wartime? I don't know. That's a complicated question. What's the proper venue for it? But criticism, whether expressed or not, I think is pretty simply valid. In fact, it's always valid. You sometimes hear people say, oh, Zionists claim that criticizing Israeli government and policy, they're claiming it's anti-Semitism. I never hear anybody make such a claim. I think it's simply a perfectly normal thing to do. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. And I'll close with just one more that I think is pretty simple. And I say this as a moral principle. Therefore, I think it applies to both sides. People who talk in eliminationist terms, that the solution for side A is the elimination of side B, are at best unhelpful. I think that's an immoral, dehumanizing way of looking at the problem. And so I think it's pretty simple to say that, and we do sometimes have deep emotions, and sometimes feelings will flutter. We're human beings. So we'll have feelings, and we'll hear people say things, and during wartime, maybe we have to give people a little bit extra space to make mistakes. But I don't think that much, because eliminationist rhetoric, which you hear from people taking moral high grounds around the world, talking about eliminating the state of Israel and destroying the lives of 7 million Jews, because they're arguing that will make things better for Palestinians, which I would argue is a pretty hard sell. That's the question of how Palestinians can make their lives better is more complex than kill all the Jews and their lives will be better. I think that's a simple, stupid solution to a complex problem. But that rhetoric itself, I don't see how anyone claims to hold moral high ground while demanding the violation of international law, of destroying a member nation of the United Nations, which exists by international law for over 3/4 of a century. So those to me are two examples. If how much can we bear is a complex problem. I think, can you criticize the Israeli government and policy? For sure. And should humans use eliminationist rhetoric towards the side of the conflict they're less inclined to feel is an affinity to? The answer is no. The answer is no. That humanity on both sides has to be respected. And so even how we talk about it, we may slip, and okay, we'll have to give ourselves a break, but we should try as best we can to make sure that our whatever our feelings are, that our language should be in line with our principles and our values. So I don't know if that's exactly 20 minutes, but I think that's basically what I had prepared to say to get the conversation going. And now I look forward to the open conversation.
Amazing.
Should we start?
Do
you want to moderate the?
Yeah. And Benji, can we kind of co-moderate? I, as usual, dominated the chat as things came up, but what often happens is that the questions keep rolling. So please feel free, if you're more comfortable, to type or more comfortable to raise your hand. But I'm going to rudely start with my own question, because I think it's really important for continuing to frame this conversation.
See, guys, I told you Amy was tough. Amy didn't believe me, but she is.
So I asked, do you think complexity, and a word that goes with that often is nuance, can be weaponized? And what I mean by that, and I've seen it used in different ways, is somebody can avoid answering a simple moral question by saying, well, it's complicated. You hinted at how that could be used. But there's also times when people, and I see this on social media a lot, where people say, listen, it's simple. This is a genocide. So they'll use the word simple as a weapon to say, don't even lean into the potential definitions or complexities of this. I'm going to morally tell you. So I'm asking that as a question and wanting to know what you think, but also I've provided a couple of examples where it can shield people from getting more information.
I mean, I'll start off. I do think that that is a form of gaslighting. And that's why that's why Benji's initial reaction resonated with me, because if I call the complex simple and the simple complex, then I am, again, either intentionally or unintentionally being intellectually and morally obtuse. If I say this is simply a genocide, in what is acknowledged to be one of the most densely populated area of the world, with over 2 million people, and Israel's killed thousands in its attempt. And we don't, however many are combatants, and whatever the real number is, I can't think of a less genocidal. I mean, this is a. I don't know that there's ever been an army. I would argue there has never been an army more careful about limiting civilian casualties in the Israeli army. So that's a gaslighting trick, and I assume that's what you mean by weaponizing.
It's a very popular one, though. A very popular gaslighting trip.
And I think people have fallen for it, and so that's why I say sometimes people are making it as a bad faith propaganda weapon, and some people have fallen for that propaganda. I think that's what you're seeing on social media. So, okay, that's why our own sense of clarity for ourselves is so important. And
our own sense of clarity is going to help address that. But something that's come up for me in this simple and complex, and the way that people frame the current war as a genocide, is, well, it's a war, and there are casualties, there are human casualties in wars, and that's simple. I mean, if you look at World War II and the number of civilians that were killed in England, in Britain, I mean, that's a part of the historical record that people don't look back and say, well, that was a genocide. It's simply a war. And I think that using genocide in that way it's a simple solution to cast blame. And I want to have more conversations with people about how wars work, but I actually think that this generation, people who didn't see World War II or Vietnam in their own eyes, are really unfamiliar with warfare. And that's a simple problem. That they're not familiar with the history, they're not familiar with military strategy, they're not familiar with the tragedy of civilian casualties. So they call it a genocide, even though it's being tactically very, very complex and very, very careful.
Yeah. I don't know that it's all that new. When John Lennon is thinking about, you say you want a revolution, you say it's it's the institution. If you want money if you want money for people with minds that hate, well, you can tell his brother, you have to wait. In other words, there has always been this militant pacifism in certain extreme camps, that does that value judgment of those in power are evil, even if they're doing good morally, and those without power are good, even if what they're doing is evil. And so that paradigm, you're right. I think I'm yes-anding you. Yes, that paradigm has become more popular as populations have less experience, ironically, in a more peaceful world. But what do you think? We have a genocide expert who's now ducking. Are you trying to not be called on, Alan?
Genocide expert.
Alan.
Yes, he's getting his PhD in genocidal studies.
Oh, Alan.
Oh, sorry. At that point, my audio went out. I couldn't hear you. So I did what I was thinking about.
Benji just accused you of being a PhD in genocide. I don't know that that's a compliment, but
Holocaust and genocide.
Genocidal studies.
Holocaust and genocide. That's different. That's better.
My kids do make fun of me all the time. It's true.
What was your question?
What do you think about this issue? Well, how do you delineate between massive civilian casualties due to warfare and a genocide?
Well, so that goes a little bit my question to you. That actually asked to Amy, if you're looking at that, about proportionality.
Yeah. I was gonna ask your question. Yes. So if you see in the chat there.
I mean, genocide genocide, in fact, you could, that has become a weaponized word, is what I think you're saying, Amy. That's become a weaponized word, and it's misused. Also, Holocaust. Both those terms are terms that are used.
Also apartheid.
Also apartheid.
Apartheid also, right, in ways that are not certainly not applicable. You know, genocide, and genocide was actually made the term. It's a legal term, and the problem with that is most people don't think in legal manners. That's exactly right. It's a legal term, and how much of us think legally, right? So they all of a sudden, just if a lot of people are killed, we think that's a genocide because we're not thinking about it, that we're talking about law here, really. And the legal term is very, very specific, that there's intent for total destruction, and then acts that are carried out towards that group, whether they're completely destroyed or not. So if you have, and that's the special, in terms when it comes to law, that is the special intent that you need when you're talking about genocide. So therefore, that when an army clearly is not targeting an entire group, but rather targeting the fighters, the militants, what have you, in the group, the bases, and all those things. So it's clearly not genocide. But in the world, people don't think like that. And then it gets the proportionality. Though when proportionality means that if you're not proportional, that doesn't mean you're committing genocide. I mean, if you kill too many people, then it's considered by international law that you should have killed in that any given military act. That's not considered genocide, but it could be considered a war crime or a crime against humanity, right? Which are different legal categories. These are all different legal categories in international law that are within the UN, different conventions that made those. So, but yeah.
Alan, I mean, intent is actually a little murky in terms of, I think, especially in the popular imagination, that you might say, okay, but people who are feeling extremely critical of Israel's actions in Gaza right now would say, look at these buildings, the infrastructure being bombed, lots of politicians mentioning women and babies, and this is all hinting at an intent to destroy. And this goes back also to Michael's eliminationist rhetoric, because there is some eliminationist rhetoric regarding Hamas, at least, and sometimes Gaza as a place.
So, so if you see the Israeli government, and you notice it's very, very careful that they are targeting Hamas's political and military structure. They're not going to destroy people, and when they're destroying the buildings, it's because those buildings, hopefully they can prove, have all military targets. Even though they're civilian buildings, that was what Mike was saying about the hospitals. Hamas is using it as military bases, and once they use that as that, so therefore, hopefully in the future, and Israel is documenting all this, when there will be those things that we know will come afterwards from the UN and in the world, they'll be able to say, no, here are the pictures of Hamas gunmen shooting out of this building, or Islamic Jihad, don't let us not forget, shooting out of this building at our soldiers. And therefore that becomes a very apt thing. And that's why also Israeli government is not saying that there's any intent to destroy Palestinian people. There's no intent to even destroy Gaza or take over Gaza. The most that there's been controversy on is Israel retaining some kind of security control for an undefined amount of time, but there's no talk.
Although the prime minister
clearly,
Alan, the prime minister did chide some members of his coalition for using language that he thought was inappropriate. So
yeah, and
they're not as careful.
Throw them
they're
out
not
of the
as careful
government,
as they
if you ask me. If I can,
I think so.
No, because that is very dangerous when it comes to that. It's putting Israel in a very difficult position. Also, we don't believe that. I don't think the consensus in Israel, and so that's why
I also don't know that I don't know that it's that complex. In other words, if Israel's intention was a genocide, I think this conflict would look radically different. And there would be hundreds of thousands of casualties very quickly, and the war would have been over by, I don't know, October 15th.
Well, first of all, that's also why the humanitarian corridors, pushing people down to the south, right? Telling people to go down to the south. All those things are to show that we're not targeting people. So it can't, you cannot use that language. No matter what, any kind of politician will say, or a person in there, These are legal categories. And just the last thing, and I want to take over Mike's thing, but you asked, but Amy, they are murky categories, and that's actually why very few people have ever been convicted from the Genocide Convention, because it's very difficult to prove intent, even from a soldier. In other words, you have to prove that that soldier killed that civilian with the intent to wipe out his whole group. So
Okay. Now I'm still on the topic of genocide and the use of genocide as a term, but I've also heard the word genocide used for the October 7th massacre. Because an intent there might be a little more clear, even though in the end the body count is around 1,200.
Body count isn't a factor. That's exactly the point. Okay. I would argue it was genocide, because the charter clearly states that out. They were told to commit those acts because they were to wipe out, and they clearly want to wipe the Jews out of Israel. They don't need to be by the way, they don't need to have to target Jews all over the world. Enough is targeting the Jews of Israel. Again, it'll get murky, and then you have to prove that each person who killed there, but I believe that you could prove it. But again, when you come to law, there's always, law is a complicated thing when you put someone on. But I do personally believe that it does fall into that category.
Okay, intent and number, I think sometimes are conflated though when people use the word genocide. But Michael, I wanted to ask you the question that Alan posed, which is proportionality, where does it fall on the simple complex spectrum?
Well, let me just start with, I think people misunderstand the concept of proportionality at war. In other words, the question of proportionality is the armed force using more power than they need to achieve their military goals? In other words, instead of blowing up the base, we've blown up half the civilian population of the country, whether with genocidal intent or not. You didn't need to do that to take out the target. Why did you overdo it? But with the way people frame proportionality is, here you have a weaker force against a stronger force. Why is Israel launching, using F-16 jet fighters when Hamas only has rockets? That's just stupid. I mean, that's not even simple. That's just dumb. Like you don't, if somebody comes at you with a knife and you're holding a gun, you don't have to say, wait, I gotta go get a knife because otherwise it's not fair. It's not like some dumb Western where or some weird duel. This isn't the last act of Hamilton where you have to, check that both guns are equal. That's not how war works. And when and a terrorist organization does not get to say, well, that's not, why don't you just use terror tactics against us? Come into Gaza and rape a bunch of us to death. That would be fair. Like that, it's meaningless to say that both sides have to have equal proportion, which is how I see it being used on social media. The question itself is a reasonable question. In other words, you can ask, I think and historians debate, were Hiroshima and Nagasaki proportionally necessary in World War II? And the United States argued that it was, and I think they can make their case, and I think there's arguments for and against it. But that's the question of proportionality. Could you have defeated Japan with less damaging tactics? It's not clear that they could, but obviously that's not our question for today. But the proportionality question in war ethics is, are you killing more people than you need to? Or are you raining more destruction than you need to achieve your military goals? And here, you could argue that Israel is doing more than it needs to. Again, you would have to make that argument with humility. That's the kind of argument that's best made by historians. I'm not saying that to provide political cover for Israel, but just because these are complex questions and there's a million pieces and we don't know them in real time. So we can have like I said earlier, we can have an opinion, but with the humility that we don't really know what's going on. 20 years from now, we'll read a history book and we'll see, maybe Michael Oren will write the history of this war, and we'll see how many of the different factors and how the decisions were made. And part of what generals have to do is think proportionately. Not only, by the way, in addition to the moral obligation to protect the lives of civilians and being proportional, an army also has the responsibility to protect the lives of its own soldiers. And people don't talk about that enough. In other words, let's say this is a proportional question. right? I can blow up that whole building and kill everybody. Or I could go room to room, door to door, knocking on each door to avoid killing civilians. Maybe one is proportionately more gentle, but it's going to mean massive casualties of my own soldiers to have to go room to room. I don't know that it's proportionally necessary to rule out bombing the building if that means losing 100 of my own soldiers, because it's the officer's responsibility to bring his soldiers back home. So these are incredibly complicated questions. I think proportionality is a complicated question that I think is often completely misunderstood and misdiscussed as a silly, I don't know what they're talking about.
I mean, and speaking of misunderstood or framed oddly, something I see a lot in the simple signs and slogans that people carry in the pro-Palestinian marches or ceasefire marches are, bombing civilians is not self-defense. That's one of the slogans. And framing war as not understanding that a response is a form of defense for a country, but it's framed as a brutal, lethal, disproportionate, unrelated to a country's self-defense. And that's something I think the sloganizing of certain terms or chants or signs also creates really deep misunderstandings about warfare.
Well, that's the point. That's the goal, is to create misunderstandings. And you'll notice that the leaders of the free world aren't falling for that. In other words, you'll hear in the rhetoric of the leaders of the free world, I often don't like it because it's saying, like, now Israel, you better. Now, I know that Israel's being careful of civilians, so I don't like that finger wagging of you better be careful about civilians. But for political reasons, probably domestically, those leaders need to use that language to show that they do care about civilians on the other side. But in terms of policy and in terms of what they're talking about, they're saying, Israel, go ahead. Like, we get it. Like, you have to eliminate Hamas. That is a moral responsibility. And so you're right. Anytime a civilian is killed, that's not self-defense. I don't understand. I mean, it is tragic that civilians are killed in modern warfare. It is tragically unavoidable, especially in warfare where I saw somebody say, how dare they accuse Hamas of using human shields? That's racist. That's Islamophobia. I don't think it is. I don't think most Muslims use human shields when they're committing acts of barbarism. So the reality is tragic.
And one of the things I see, Michael, sometimes happening, just to carry on with this line of thought, is in the New York Times, actually, one of the headline sort of analysis pieces was there's competing narratives, quote unquote, about whether the Shifa Hospital or other hospitals in Gaza actually have a military headquarters. One narrative, this is a way to complexify something which is, really dangerous. One narrative, the Gazan Health Authority narrative, is that no, not at all. What you saw was just mamad. It was just a place. It was just a safe room that had these weapons and toilets and other things. But the Israeli narrative, which also can be weaponized, because once you say something is a narrative, you complexify it, but you also say that there could be more than one truth, and we're never really going to know. And the Israeli narrative is that there are Hamas headquarters embedded in multiple hospitals. How can we possibly know? But there's going to be evidence, and there is evidence, but some of that evidence is not being corroborated by independent sources, and that's something that's happening a lot in this war too. But I'm tossing these competing narratives out as a way to complexify a situation that's actually quite simple. There are military headquarters in hospitals, and that's part of the reason why, and schools and mosques and playgrounds and community centers, and all of those things are going to be documented visually, but it's considered something that could actually be competing. And I think that in academic contexts, people often lean back on competing narratives as a way to back away from any moral clarity. You can just say, well, there's two different stories here, and we're just watching and describing both. And I even found myself doing that as a way to not come out as some crazy rabid Zionist in an American classroom. But it's not complex. There's going to be empirical evidence that one of those narratives is true, but there's also going to be people like Holocaust deniers and people who are denying already that there were rapes, which is going to become increasingly complex as October 7th moves away from us in time, to be able to get samples what we would normally get with a rape kit within 48 hours.
It's too late.
It's too late. And there's people who are saying, well, they're the Zionists go lying again, always playing the victim. Those women, we don't know if they were ever raped. And loss of evidence is a real hit for something that could be very simple, but becomes complex if you don't have hard evidence.
I don't know. I don't know if anybody looks at the evidence. In other words, I think what you're describing, first of all, at the start of your comments, what you're describing is bad journalism, and the New York Times is certainly guilty of that on a fairly regular basis, not entirely, but often, and framing reality and fabrication as two sides of an argument. Remember George Bush's "Let's teach the controversy" about whether evolution happened, or well, in Israel right now, maybe it's day. There are two narratives. That's bad journalism posing as unbiased journalism, and reality. Whatever biases journalists should have, it should be towards reality as opposed to lies. It shouldn't be political or but I don't remember the New York Times after 9/11 saying, well, there are two narratives here. One is that the United States has encroached and that Al Qaeda is simply pushing back to free Saudi Arabia. And so United States citizens are legitimate targets. And the other narrative is that they committed a heinous act of terror and killed 3,000 Americans. They can do that to Israel. They don't do it to other countries. There's major dysfunction in how people talk about Israel, and I don't think we're going to change that in the near future, Amy. And our belief. Well, what are we going to do about it? Well, I don't know that. Ultimately, what Israel is doing is, in your case about the massive rapes, which not only are there eyewitness accounts of both people who survived, of the teams that came to pick the bodies and found the obvious evidence of it, and then brought those bodies in to be identified, and didn't take rape kits, because when you're dealing with over 1,000 casualties, they're not treating it as crime scenes for. But you also have members of Hamas openly saying that right. is what they were told to do, and so the evidence is it's like Holocaust denial. It's not that you can stop it. It's you can call it out. And those people who want to good faith understand the truth, which ends up being actually most people, we tend to, as Jews, be understandably paranoid and look at the half-empty part of the glass that have these, these anti-Semitic denials of reality, where Jews are concerned, is so troubling. But certainly in the United States and in other countries as well, most people pretty much got what happened on October 7th and understand, whether they criticize Israel's response particularly, but they understand that Hamas. So it's not totally working, this gaslighting rhetoric of denial of reality, of this Orwellian inversion of the truth isn't as. It's President Lincoln. You can fool some of the people all the time. You can fool all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And at the end of the day, the truth will out.
We've been having a lot of good conversation, and I am not hearing very much from the audience. That sometimes naturally happens, but since we're in our last several minutes, I do want to invite anyone to either type or raise their hand if something came up in your mind while we were having this discussion and you want to ask. Now is the time. I have more questions, but I'm opening this up. Looking. Okay. I think I want to end with this question, Mike. What about eliminationist rhetoric against Hamas? Is that acceptable?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, as it is against ISIS or Nazis, organizations which have proven to be. I don't think the term genocidal is inappropriate, but whether you use it or not, that their intentions are acts of barbarism, crimes against humanity, and their capabilities allow them to match their intentions. You can't have a civilized world with organizations like that running around. And so it becomes the burden of free peoples to destroy those organizations from being capable. The idea of Al Qaeda and ISIS still exists, and Hamas will still, those ideas will still exist. Well, it's true, but there's a reason that we're not, that Al Qaeda operationally has been shut down for the present, and that is an important moral responsibility of free peoples everywhere.
But here's something to make it a little bit more complex. And I'm quoting actually a young soldier who said this at a meal that I overheard. He said, okay, it's easy enough to imagine eliminating the head of the snake, all Hamas higher up operatives. But he said, I don't believe that there's any child in Gaza the age of 6 or older that hasn't already been poisoned. And I don't think we can eliminate Hamas without. And he feels like Gaza needs to be wiped out. Now, this is somebody in their 20s. They're in the midst of, a battle mentality.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it is eliminationist rhetoric, and it's also showing that Hamas is not necessarily a finite group of people. It could be an ideology that doesn't die along with some of the top head people.
Yeah, I don't think that rhetoric is acceptable. Although I do think to a certain extent you have to understand it and take it. Every Israeli child, Hamas says, is a future soldier and therefore is a valid target. In other words, when Hamas and the first days after October 7th said we don't target civilians, well, that's because they don't define any Israelis as civilians, and so that type of thinking. And by the way, if I had told you in 1935 that in a century Germany and Japan would be positive contributors to global civilization, to democracies everywhere, you would have said, well, Germans and Japanese are, I mean, I'm not saying you would, but one could have said then, and many people did. There's something wrong with the Germans and the Japanese. They're just always going to be
in their blood. Yeah.
It's in their blood. They've been raised this way. They'll never get better. And sometimes you need these massive traumatic events to happen in their society, followed by a Marshall Plan in those cases that made huge cultural change. And so those kids grew up, most of them, to create societies that were positive and productive, where people live in freedom and a good degree of dignity. And so, to say that Palestinians are incapable of that is, I think, racist. I'm not optimistic that there will be a successful Marshall Plan in Gaza. There's a part of me that hopes, and that this is the beginning of a new era of Palestinian culture. I don't know that that's going to be possible, but it could be possible.
I think that is a good note to end on for this more formal part of the discussion, and that societies grow, change, are fluid, have new influences, have traumas that knock them out of a stagnant phase, and that we can't imagine that what's happening now is going to go on forever. I am going to stop the recording. Thank you to everybody who's joined us and welcome you to stay on. Especially thank you to Michael and everybody
and my mom who's still hanging in there.
Mom who's still hanging in there. It's late for us here. I feel myself getting kind of crazy. Thank you all. Recording is stopping.